Hello MCC Rising 3 players and other people who enjoy Sands of Time. I've been debating ever since the event was announced whether I wanted to make a video for you and what topics it would cover. There's a lot I'd like to say, but I don't have time to put it all into a video and I was having trouble deciding what I most wanted to share. But then I remembered Rising 2. If there was anything I could have told them, what would it be? Anyone who watched the event probably knows where I'm going with this. The teams of MCC Rising 2 combined to set records in Sands of Time, and not in a good way. The worst part is, if there's any game in the event that an MCC player wants to perform well in, it's Sands. So today is time to learn from the mistakes of your predecessors to ensure you can put up a better performance when you get the chance. The MCC Rising 2 teams did not collect many coins. Additionally, half the players got locked in, and only 2 teams managed to go lossless. There were clearly issues with sand collection, so let's take a look at what they were. First of all, many teams saw runners doing parkour and puzzles instead of going down tunnels. If immediately upon entering a path you see a piston puzzle or a vertical parkour challenge, you should leave and find a different path. There's one exception, being that this specific room is an intersection found in tunnels rather than a parkour challenge, but otherwise you should not be climbing any towers directly off of spawn until every tunnel, including the unmarked paths, is fully explored. This was only one of the problems teams faced. Some teams sent their 3 runners down each of the 3 vault tunnels, which is a strategy I endorse because vault tunnels are always guaranteed to be of substantial length. Unfortunately for the Rising 2 teams, multiple vault paths saw some of the game's most difficult rooms appear near their beginning. The runners of these paths did not collect much sand as a result, starving even the most strategically sound teams of sand. The red path was the most egregious, but its problems began before the players even entered it. Red path runners typically grab the red key prior to entering the path, but that's only useful if they actually find the red vault. Otherwise, it's time spent gathering few coins and no sand. Only 2 teams opened the red vault this event, and neither had enough time remaining to allow the runner to return to safety. I'd recommend that runners ignore the red key, and they can request that the sandkeeper do the puzzle if they feel they are making substantial progress down the red path. Now for the red path itself. The first issue was this segment here, a sequence of 4 connected spawners that overall looks like this. The 1 block wide hallways connecting each of its rooms makes it difficult to quickly address the spawners, as the mobs can enter the hallways and slow you down. It's also possible to get a bit disoriented here if you're not familiar with the overall shape of the segment. Then immediately after this came a hallway containing nothing but decorative blocks, then the dark cave room. The dark cave room is a very tricky room. It's a 3-way intersection that requires breaking cracked blocks in multiple places in order to get through it. Some of those places include all 3 of its entrances, meaning that if you forget you can break cracked blocks, it just appears to be a dead end. And some people did forget that. This is where the totally pointless hallway came into play. People often assume that everything in Sands of Time serves some sort of purpose, but the purpose of the features in the hallway is simply decorative. They even went so far as to mine the blocks, hoping that it would accomplish something. There are actually very few blocks that you can interact with in Sands of Time, so aside from cracked blocks, spawners, sand, and cobwebs, you should not be mining anything you see. It will not accomplish anything besides wasting your time. After testing the size of the hallway, these players' struggles only worsened. They returned to the 4 spawner segment and checked for a path that they may have missed. They didn't miss any paths, since despite the fact that it's built up of a bunch of small rooms and corridors, it only has 2 places it can connect to other segments. This segment is functionally a hallway. But this isn't clear if you're not very knowledgeable about the dungeon, which even many of MCC's top players are not. So our poor protagonist scoured every wall of these rooms. They look unlike nearly every other room in the dungeon, so surely they are hiding secrets, right? Look, you can even swim up this water stream. It just brings you to this room. Nobody was able to find a secret passageway leading from one of the rooms to the red vault, and those who tried ultimately got locked in as they lost track of time in their panic. And as bad as that was, the red path at the very least had one feature the others did not: easily visible vault markings. If you're a runner in Sands of Time, and preferably even if you're a sandkeeper, you need to know what the vault path markings look like. They are half-block tall colored strips that denote that a certain branch of the dungeon contains the vault of its color somewhere down its path. Unfortunately, checking a path for vault markings isn't always possible without entering it. Some rooms are not capable of displaying vault markings, so you may have to explore a few segments deep to determine the status of a path. This is the case for both the blue and gold paths here, of which neither have vault markings visible from the timer room. The gold path is especially bad, as you can only see its markings by either breaking these cracked blocks or venturing beyond this maze segment. Speaking of which, it's time to meet another type of difficult room: the maze. Mazes are 4-way intersections with an entrance on each side of a grid of rooms. It's hard to realize this when you're actually inside one though, as the walls are too high to normally see over. There are two types of mazes, a lighter colored 5x5 grid with no cracked blocks, and a darker 4x4 grid with them. The 4x4 grid also contains creepers, so watch out for those. There actually is a method to get a better view of the maze, being a third-person perspective. We can see here that the 4x4 maze has vault markings up high, which can't be seen during normal gameplay. The 5x5 maze, however, does not contain them. If you see one at the beginning of a path, you may have to go through it to determine whether or not the path contains a vault. The vault markings, or lack thereof, were far from the only problem the maze posed in Rising 2. Most players who tried it only found one of its exits, and as I said earlier, there can be up to 3 not including where you entered from. But the biggest problem of all was getting lost. 3 players got locked in while trying to navigate the maze, and most who entered it got a bit lost at some point during their run, wasting some of the already scarce time they had. There are 2 methods that can help navigate a maze like this, and using either should at the very least help to prevent major time losses. The first is a general maze tip that you may have heard of before, hugging the wall. If you always stick to the wall on one side, you're eventually going to reach an exit. This is really handy in mazes with multiple exits like these, since you also know which of the exits you'll end up at. For example, if you begin here and hug the right wall, you're going to end up over here. Then if you do the same thing, you'll go here. Then if you want to go back, you can hug the left wall instead. If for some reason you don't like hugging the wall, or you want to track where you've been, you can use an altered version of carpet tracking. Normally, players place carpet on one side of the path so they know which direction they're going. If the carpet's on the right as you explore new areas, it will be on the left when you return home. This doesn't work that well in mazes though. They have uneven ground which prevents carpet placement, and simply placing carpet in the holes in the walls isn't very helpful since they don't convey direction. Instead, you can use your torches for this. Placing a torch on the side of a passage gives directionality, as it will be on your right going one way and your left on the other. Although this doesn't help you find the other exits like wall hugging does, it does allow you to navigate back home more quickly. The only vault path I haven't yet covered is the blue path, and it too gave players issues, of course. The culprit this time isn't any singular room, but a combination which produced a result that is harder than the sum of its parts. The first room encountered is the vertical 3-way intersection. On its own, it's not threatening whatsoever, since it does not contain mobs and the water pool at the bottom makes it difficult to even take fall damage. But the rooms it led to created a very unique set of circumstances that players were ill-equipped to handle. Players entered the intersection from the top and made their way downward to explore the branching paths. If they walk down the block spiral, the first branch they'd enter is the middle path, which is a simple dead-end hallway with 2 zombie spawners. They'll spend a bit of time breaking the spawners and killing the mobs, then they'll go down to the bottom layer. What they'll find there is a zombie spawner and a pillager spawner, which are close enough to the vertical intersection that they were active while the middle path was being cleared. It's difficult to fight these mobs, as there isn't much room to backpedal. You'll either end up in the water as an easy target for the pillagers, or up a spiral from which you can't deal much damage. The only solution is to grit your teeth and push past the mobs to light up the spawners, then focus on fighting them. Otherwise, they'll spawn at a greater rate than you can kill them. The other approach to the intersection is to immediately drop all the way down and do the bottom path first. This would be the best way to go about things in this specific scenario, although you'll never actually know what's best when you're playing since you don't know where the paths lead, of course. Dropping down immediately would mean you'd have less mobs in your way when you go to light up the spawners. But you need to light up the spawners immediately in order to take advantage of this. If you don't, not only will more zombies and pillagers spawn in the way, but a nasty surprise will await you. Zombies are capable of tracking a player through walls, so the zombies spawning on the middle path above will locate you and drop onto you if you take too long clearing the bottom path. This section was responsible for the only non-timer related death in the event, and also held back every player who encountered it except for one. The blue vault went unfound this event, and if we check further down the path we can see at least 3 branches that went unexplored. It very well could have resided in this area. That covers the difficulties of the vault paths, and while learning how to handle those sections is helpful, I'd like to re-emphasize something I mentioned earlier on. Even though the difficult vault paths foiled even the well-prepared teams, the number one cause of wasted time was still runners not going down paths. It is very important as a runner to go down a path because that's where you'll find sand. Far too many runners in Rising 2 spent lots of time wandering the hub room or doing puzzles or parkour challenges, which does not yield any sand. Some were doing so because they couldn't find their assigned vault path, but if that's the case, you should go down an unmarked path instead. Sure, it's not the ideal choice, but it's much better than not exploring whatsoever. Even though a sand drought is mainly a running problem, the Sandkeepers also hold some responsibility for what transpired. First of all, 20 people got locked in. There were clearly cases of letting the timer run far too low before hitting the panic button. I believe that an experienced runner should be given at least 90 seconds to reach the timer room from any point in the dungeon, and for inexperienced players I'd bump that number up as high as 120 for some extra leeway. Callbacks are tricky since you have to balance safety with the snowball effect of time. The more time you give your runners to explore, the more sand they will find, which gives more time which can be used to find even more sand. A Sandkeeper's priority in the early game should be to find as much sand as possible so that the first callback can be deferred as late as possible. Make sure you collect not only all the sand in the hub room, including spots like the dark corners and the Sphinx that are sometimes missed, but also sand found just inside the 11 branches too. The green vault typically contains around 4 sand, parkour and puzzle rooms often have a piece tucked away in the corner that can't be seen from outside, and it's also worth grabbing any sand in the tunnels that you can see from their entrances. And runners, every piece of sand I've mentioned here you should not pick up. That's the Sandkeeper's job, and if you take any of that sand down a tunnel with you, then you're forcing an earlier first callback. That sums up the major pitfalls players encountered in MCC Rising 2. While this obviously doesn't fully prepare you for playing Sands of Time, hopefully at the very least you can avoid repeating the mistakes they made and put up a better performance than these. I encourage you to check out my other videos if you haven't already, since you might find some helpful advice for other games. I'd also appreciate it if you like and subscribe. The MCC Rising 2 players weren't subscribed, and look what happened to them. You wouldn't want to repeat that, would you?